Murdorf and the Mortal Flaw, Book 1, Chapter 15, The Wise in the Green. "Wake up," Windsor said to Novatian, prodding him on the shoulder with his staff. "Coffee is on the table." Vandorf had been up for hours. Anticipation had given way to restlessness. He had precisely packed everything he needed, each item having its own spot in his saddle-bag. Nothing was out of order and everything was clean. The riders awoke and began to prepare to ride, donning their gear and packing their bags. Flea slipped off to another room, away from the others, to flip his medallion one last time, seeking clarification concerning his decision to ride. Thoughts of possibly dying caused Flea to have second thoughts. Tossing his lucky coin, Flea soliloquized, "If I'm supposed to go, then let it land on the image of the tree, and if I'm not supposed to go, then let it land on the image of the dragon." Tossing his coin into the air, it landed on the tree. He gripped it with enthusiasm, the confirmation he was hoping for. "Fleece, come on," Vandorf shouted from the other room as he put on his polished riding boots and strapped his finely sharpened sword to his side. "And put down that stupid coin." Fleece gathered his belongings and tucked his lucky medallion safely inside his pocket. He had a hunch he would need it along the way. Now, the earth dwellers sharply disagree with all manner of war. So when the riders rode out the next morning, they received more than a couple of unwelcoming glances. The esoteric community was aware of Vandorf's controversial views, thus some in the community outright shunned him. But Vandorf paid no mind, and neither did he hold a grudge. He politely nodded as he rode by, knowing in his heart that he was doing what he felt was right. He knew from experience that war was hell and peace was far greater. But he also knew from experience that sometimes fighting can be a means to self-preservation and the preservation of others. This knowledge haunted him night and day. It was his once pacifist ways that had reduced his life to what it was now, sad and unfulfilling. Vandorf had a reason to fight. The riders traveled over mountains and plains. They crossed into needle-leaf forest with rolling hills. Everything was pine green, as though fall had not touched this part of the country. The riders inhaled the fresh scent, allowing the pleasant aroma to tickle their nostrils. By day they made progress through the terrain, and by night they set up camp and slept. Routinely, Vandorf polished off the day's dirt that had accumulated on his boots, wiping clean his gear, dusting off his clothes, and grooming his horse. It was a compulsion he couldn't help. He liked cleanliness. He would bathe daily if water were available. They neared the land of the giants when Windsor pulled back on his reins. "We're not alone. Stick together," he said. They drew their swords and steeled themselves for a battle. "Looks like there's a bunch of derves ahead," Novatian said, pointing to a row of trees tainted with green slime. The green slime was hardly noticeable against the verdant pine trees, but experienced eyes know what to look for. Moments later they heard the faint whisperings and hideous laughter from the trees above, hiding among the foliage. The whispers followed them around every bend, every tree, and every winding crook in the trail. Giddy whispers breathed intimidating, defeatist words. The whispers began to get inside their heads. "The sword is your strength," whispered a derv. "This is far too dangerous. It's going to get yourselves killed," said another, its wily voice sending chills down their spines. "Why don't you just use the sword for yourselves?" another advised. "The only way you can succeed is with the sword of power," said another. It almost made sense if you listened to it long enough and were easily swayed by lies and legends, or if you were hungry for power. As they plodded along in the forest, they could hear the derves above them jumping from tree to tree, following them and taunting them with their babbling lines of pessimism. "You should turn back. You know this is a useless mission," said one. "Or use the sword," dared another. "Yes, use the sword," echoed another. One after another taunted them. Their persuasive and tempting lies rattled their rational thinking and pure motives. Breathing down their necks, they harassed them with enticing fantasies. Growing weary of their antagonism, Vandorf knocked his bow, aimed, and shot into a tree. The piercing shriek rang out, and the derv fell out of the tree, barely missing Murdorf. Vendorf knocked his bow again and shot his arrow a second time, hitting another derv. Another high-pitched screech rang out, followed by the sound of the wounded derv running through the forest. Thud! The derv fell dead, an arrow sticking out from its back. Now derves sprang down from the trees on top of the riders, their claws raking on them, ripping at their flesh. With expert prowess, Nadora thrust her sword through one that had landed on top of her, sliced open its abdomen of another, then threw her dagger into the backside of a third. Meanwhile, the others held their own, driving their swords through the hellish varmints and popping them with arrows. It was not until Nadora took serious action that the devilish creatures ran off, almost as one, into the overgrowths of the forest. Coming face to face with one of the few varmints bold enough to confront her, she beheaded it just before it extracted its claws. Still, holding the decapitated head, she ranted and raved like a madwoman as she drove her sword through every diabolical creature she set eyes on. In a speedy frenzy, they turned and ran for their lives. Why, she's even more sexy when she's angry, Novatian thought. The fire in her eyes burned an enticing curiosity within him. The riders were bleeding, their flesh was tattered and torn, sweat dripped from their faces and mingled with their blood. Vendorf was first to speak. If derves are fighting us this boldly, then Darvan either thinks that we have the sword, or he is aware that we are rounding up riders. Yes, probably both, Windsor agreed. He is certainly aware of the prophecies, but I am sure they think we are carrying the sword with us. The riders trotted along through the forest, unaware that ahead of them, lurked in the trees, were yet another group of derves, joined now by the ones who had escaped the riders only moments ago. Meanwhile, just below them were the approaching shadowy figures of a band of riders of Quadar, their black capes draping over their shoulders. "Circle of riders are just ahead," whispered several derves to the Quadarist, all eager to be the informative one. As the riders neared the last leg of the forest, they heard hoofs pounding the ground. "Get ready, here they come," Vandorf said. The riders that trusted in armor quickly strapped on their mail. A single rider galloped full speed towards Novatian. Novatian's sword clashed as he parried off the rider's sword, then turned back and cut the rider down, the red blood splattering onto Valor's black scales. Another Quadarist circled around to the back side of Nadora, her bow aimed at a dark rider. With her attention focused in front of her, she did not see the warrior approaching from behind. His sword was raised high, and just as he was about to swing his sword, he suddenly arched his back and fell straightway from his horse. He lay dying. One of Vandorf's homemade spindle sticking out from his neck. Then Novatian rode up from behind. Meanwhile, Skinner and Fleece found themselves overwhelmed by the forces of darkness. Skinner, skilled and experienced, was not moved by their number, but Fleece, skilled but inexperienced, grew faint-hearted. Perhaps I can outrun them, Fleece thought. Then he turned his horse around and galloped through the forest away from the riders, a slew of Quadarists treading on his heels, thirsty for blood. "No, Fleece!" yelled Skinner. Skinner's yell alerted the others to Fleece's departure. Turning their horses around, the riders galloped in the direction Fleece had fled in, still engaging the Quaidarists, who pursued them with reprisal, all eager to hold the honor of killing one of these men. With Vandorf and Nimry leading the way, they raced after Fleece, fighting off riders of Quaidar. With superb skill, Nimry proved himself to those who didn't know him. The smoothness of his parry, the strength of his swing, a watchful eye, and a vigor of his youth, a total asset. Vandorf utilized his homemade weapons, while Medora rode with her bow nocked, firing arrow upon arrow, never missing her target. A warrior of Quaidar circled around, seeking to cut them off further down the path. Straightway the Quaidars plunged in front of Vandorf, knocking him off his horse. Fighting his attacker from the ground, the earth dweller tripped over a rock. The rider turned his horse again, aiming to run his sword through Vandorf. Vandorf hoped to roll out of the reach of the blade, but there was nowhere to roll, for a large fallen tree was beside him. He reached for his dagger, but it had shifted in the fall. Suddenly, Skinner rode swiftly by with his sword drawn and cut the rider down the side. "Thanks, mate," Vandorf said, picking up his sword before immediately engaging 3 more riders and swiftly cutting them down. The fight led the riders out of the forest and into the clearing. Medora left off her dragon and onto a large rock, where she swiftly strung arrows through the decaying men, one after another. But it was Mongard and Windsor who brought a swift end to the battle. Like a wild man, Mongard leapt here and there with a simple dagger in his hand and brought swift justice to every dark rider within his reach. His slender body moved with grace off the sides of trees. Windsor, on the other hand, simply spoke 2 words and the rest of the dark riders fell, becoming corpse almost immediately. Vandorf had a lesson to teach his pupil, one that he had failed to teach him in training. "Don't ever do that again," Vandorf yelled, raising his voice at Fleece, the front of the boy's shirt twisted in his fist. "You don't run off, you got that?" He turned the shirt loose with a shove and walked into the woods fuming mad. I knew he had no business coming. The boy was humiliated. It wasn't so much that Vandorf was angry with the young man as much as he was with himself. The weight of guilt he had carried daily for all the blood he already had on his hands bent him over in regret. The last thing he needed was more guilt, more blood, more failure. Needing to cool down, Vandorf walked. He chastised himself for putting the boy in harm's way. He had no doubt of his skill, for he was an excellent swordsman and fighter. It was his inexperience in real war that gave him concern. Being wise about conserving weapons, he pulled spindles out of the dead riders. He quickly realized this was more trouble than it was worth, since the points had sunk deep into the soft tissue of the decaying flesh. Skinner rode to catch Vandorf's horse, which had ran back into the forest and down an embankment. "There you are," whispered Skinner, spying the horse. Suddenly, from behind a tree, a sword swung with great force, smashing Skinner in the chest, breaking his chainmail and sinking into his flesh. Skinner's sword fell to the ground. With his breath nearly knocked out of him, he struggled for air. His disoriented mind tried to ascertain what was happening, while his wounded body tried to respond out of a sheer will to live. Skinner opened his eyes to see what had hit him and stared into the rotten face of evil. The sword was in full swing, moving rapidly towards his body. Skinner screamed, hearing the blood-chilling cry. The riders raced up the hill. As they approached the top of the hill, they saw the back of a Quaidarist, his sword raised high in the air. Beneath his brawny arms and his sharp sword lay Skinner, helpless and wounded. Vandorf reached for an arrow from his quiver. As Novatian was fumbling with his bow, the arrow already in hand. Suddenly they watched, as out of nowhere an arrow pierced through the back of the rider of Quaidar. His mouth gaped open as he fell on top of Skinner. Medora had instinctively knocked her bow in the blink of an eye and let loose an arrow that whipped through the air with incredible speed. Now those in doubt had gained a new respect for her. She was one of them. With their hearts racing, and the riders ran towards their friend, Skeeter. Trembling, Skeeter pushed the dying dark rider off and took a deep breath. In that moment, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Tiny but discernible vibrations went through their bodies. The riders remained calm, knowing what territory they were in. Then two giants emerged from over the hill near the rocks where the fighting had taken place. They had heard the commotion. Noticing an injured party among them, they kindly volunteered to help. "Just over these two hills is my land," said one of the giants. "We will take you to someone who can help," said the other giant. "Put him on Orpha," Medora suggested, taking charge, but Skeeter insisted on riding his own mount. "We're going to see Gilgore," Windsor explained. "Oh, I can take you to him," replied the giant. "Why don't we ride ahead and give him a warning that one is injured," said the other giant. The giants, Windsor, Nimri, Vandorf, rode ahead, leaving the rest of the gang to ride along with Skeeter. "Oh, I wish I were a prophet," Nimri said, thinking out loud. "A great responsibility comes with such a gift," said Windsor. Windsor's reply gave Nimri sharp consideration to something that he had never considered about the prophetic. The awesome responsibility. Now he wondered what that must be like. After all, Gilmanza had talked much about the great responsibility that came with knighthood. He had a hunch that it was a weightier task with enormous accountability. "Here," Novatian said to Medora, "why don't you ride Valor while I walk Orpah and Skeeter's horse?" "Well, if you insist," she replied with a smile. As much as she loved riding her dragon, she was missing riding her stiletto. Springing up on the mount, she gave him his rein, and he broke into a brisk trot. "Now that's a fair lady," Skeeter said, whispering to Novatian. "But she's a princess. I'm a commoner." "Out of the question," explained Novatian. "But she's not a traditional princess. I mean, she doesn't act like one." "No," Novatian agreed. "She's a warrior, and that's not quite the kind of woman I want to marry. I might make her mad and lose my head." He lied. Approaching the top of the mountain, the riders could see beautiful rolling hills below. It was the land of the giants. Everything in the city was huge. The buildings were high, the walls were lofty, the doors were tall, and the chairs were gigantic. The riders felt like ants in a human's world. Arriving at Gilmanza's house, they helped Skeeter off Orpah. Gilmanza towered over the riders as he warmly greeted them, seeming particularly pleased to see Windsor. Novatian and Vandorf assisted their wounded comrade into the giant's home. It was a monstrous house. Big rooms, tall ceilings, large furniture. The plates stacked up on a table could hold 2 days' worth of food, or at least Fleece thought so, and the cups at least a day's worth of liquid. After examining his split flesh, they concluded that the wound needed stitches. Pulling out a very large sewing needle, Gilgore began awkwardly trying to thread it with his huge hands. Skeeter couldn't help but notice the size of the needle. "You're not going to stitch me with that big needle, are you?" "Yes," Gilgore affirmed, holding it between 2 fingers and threading it with the other hand. "Don't you have a smaller one?" "No, I'm having enough trouble with this little thing." "Little? What are you calling little?" Skeeter's stammer was in overdrive now. Looking again at the size of the needle, Skeeter jumped off the table. "You're not stitching me with that," he cried. "Quit being such a sissy," crowed Vandorf, grabbing a pair of scissors to trim a few wild hairs from his short, neatly trimmed beard. He preferred being clean-shaven, but without water to shave, he had little choice. So for now he kept his beard more like a field of even stubbles. "I have a needle and thread in my bag," Medora said. Refusing to even look in her direction, Skeeter picked up a very large tie rag. "This will do the trick," he said, still embarrassed to even look at the princess as he recalled again what he thought he had done in his besotted condition. Medora watched as he began to tie off the rag. At least let me put some crushed herbs and Mambergen tree root on it, she offered. Where did you get Mambergen root? Novatian was curious, since the miracle root wasn't found in any land except Shai Kadesh. Oh, the immortal king sent a live plant when I was born. I've actually kept the thing alive. Still refusing to look at her, Skeeter said not a word as he placed a giant-sized pin into the rag to secure it. Fine, suit yourself, said Medora. You have a razor? Vandor finally asked. I don't care how big it is. I can't stand this stubble, and mine is in my bag on my mount. Gilgore brought him a razor. It fit the giant's hand perfectly. Vandorf took one look at the oversized blade and feared he might mutilate himself. That's okay, mate. I'll get one out of my own bag. But soap would be nice, and the bigger the better. Gilgore showed him to the large bathroom where Vandorf was delighted to shave and to wash in a huge pail of water with giant-sized soap, getting himself thoroughly clean. Gilgore could not wait any longer and addressed Windsor. If you were simply coming to say hello, then you would just fly in. What's this about? The sword of Darvan, said Windsor. The sword of Darvan? Said Gilgore. His giant eyes opened wide with amazement. Rubbing his scruffy head, Gilgore sat straight up in his gigantic chair. Shilly-shally forward, explained Windsor, opening the scroll to explain the road's significance. No way, you're yanking my leg, said Gilgore. No one could yank that leg, Nimri secretly thought. It would take supernatural ability, some of Windsor or Navi's power. So how'd you get this nasty cut? Gilgore asked suspiciously. Riders of Quadar, answered Skeeter. So, they're already on to us, Gilgore said, a matter of fact. After a hearty supper, they were worn out and fell instantly asleep. Medora curled up in a corner with a faded blanket. A small oil lamp lit up the other corner of the room, casting a soft glow. Looking up from the cover, she watched as Novatian took off his shirt. The easy light was just enough to conjure up her unexplored romantic appetite. His chest and biceps were muscular, like that of a warrior. She wondered what he would feel like wrapped around her. Strong, soft, warm, she imagined. While she was gazing at him, he turned around, sensing a watchful eye. Catching her stare, he grinned pleasantly back at her, flattered that she was noticing him. Embarrassed that he had caught her admiring glance, she grinned and then ducked under the covers. She knew she could easily win him, but she had sworn herself to the kingdom alone. Shutting out everything from her sight, she chastised herself for allowing her mind to wander into a realm of the unknown. She had duties to the kingdom. Politics, a kingdom to run, people to protect, war to make. After sufficiently bridling her mind, she drifted off to sleep. Unfortunately, she couldn't control her dreams.